Hi, so this is a different kind of video. Today this is a presentation me and my good friend made for university. I made this so university exam boards don't get me done in for copyright or plagiarism or anything of the like. I hope you enjoy.
A Tropical Enterprise, British Planning Ideas in a Private Settlement in Brazil by Renato Leao.
The key arguments made by Reanto Leao Rego are: firstly, that certain British planning ideas and practices, i.e. the layouts, demarcations and sizes of towns, were all applied to the area of Parana where the British company were operating. And secondly, that influences of garden city concepts which were produced by Lord Lovat in London have contributed to major changes in the Parana landscape. One of the most compelling parts of his argument is that major towns were every 100 kilometres along the railway, with every small town 15 kilometres. These regulations are similar to England, with London and Norwich being 188 kilometres apart, as well as from London to Birmingham, which is roughly the same distance, and small towns like Colchester and Witham, which are roughly 22 kilometres apart as well. The Montague Mission. By 1920, the rail system in Brazil, designed mainly in the interest of the agro-export economy, had not reached a satisfactory level of development commensurate with the needs of national integration in the country. Facing the competition of road construction programs, rail line construction tended to stagnate in Brazil. This gave room for Lord Lovat to exert British influence once again in the region. Since the 19th century, Britain had invested in railroads in Brazil and supported the sector as a priority for the allocation of government resources and investments in transport. In 1924, the Montague Mission included in its recommendations, without success, some suggestions for the improvement of the rail network, which from the British point of view should receive public incentives. However, it can be suspected that in the 1920s, because Brazil was transitioning from being influenced by Britain to the United States, that Britain needed to resurge their control over the area. If the case of loans is considered, British preeminence in the realm of capital supply to Brazil dated back to the period of Brazil's independence. That situation has only been changed by a negative impact of World War I on Britain's lending power and by the simultaneous rise of the United States as a net exporter of capital and biggest creditor country in the world.
The article has many strengths and weaknesses, including his clear explanation that after the liquidation of the British company, many of the buildings and areas were still following the British design, as well as previously mentioned, the similarities in the architecture of England were clear to see in Brazil. As well as this, he also had an abundance and a huge range of sources, there being around 103. Despite the large range, very few of the sources were from the period, with there only being a handful from the 1930s, 40s and 50s. As well as that, many of the photos used in the article weren't the clearest to understand if you aren't fully aware of the differences in landscapes in Brazil and Britain during the period. But another positive would be that there are many photos, so if you look at all of the photos, eventually you'll work it out and see the differences between Brazil and Britain.
Now onto the main questions that arise from the article. One of the first questions that can be drawn is whether the British influence had caused the decline in the Parana State's urban landscape, or whether this would have been a natural occurrence despite Lord Lovat's intervention. This is because after the 1940s, when the British company was liquidated and took over by Brazilian investors, the railroads become useless, nobody was using them anymore, the towns were overgrown to currently having 2 million people in, and the green belts that were designed for the greenery were built upon with new houses, completely disregarding the plans intended by the original architects. And secondly is, how did the people of Parana feel about the redevelopment of the state? There's no evidence to suggest that the people were happy with what happened. The economy in the areas were much better. The people were probably better off. However, there's no evidence to prove this, and also there's no evidence to prove that they wanted to be taken over.
And to conclude, the article is very strong, with all the points in it being easy to understand and them all lining up to make a very clear and concise argument about the British's influence in Brazil. As well as this, many photos are used which help visualize the building and architecture that happened in Brazil. While they weren't always easy to understand at first, once reading more on in the article and comparing all the photos together, it becomes quite clear to understand how the British influenced the Brazilian landscape.